Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Libra Moon as the Luminary out of Sect, I speak with the astrologer and writer Whitney Hill. I really enjoyed this conversation. Not that I don't enjoy all the conversations that I have with my guests, but I really appreciated how knowledgeable Whitney is about Egyptian myth and spirituality, and how those things are historically intimately connected with meticulous astronomical observation and rich historical significations. So I really appreciated Whitney sharing her knowledge of all of that, and I hope that you get a lot out of it today. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm offering needle and timing consultations, as well as answering horary questions. This month, I'm also offering a discount on my readings. Please use coupon code October23 by the end of October for 25% off. Hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, Whitney, thank you so much for being with me here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Yeah, I just want to start off quickly by saying that we're recording on October 7th around 2 p.m. Eastern time. I'm in Eastern time now. I believe you are as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how has the recent astrology been for you?
It's been pretty wild. So that full moon in Aries about a week ago was right on my Mars. And then we're rolling into eclipse season that's going to hit me pretty directly. So it's been a lot of insomnia. It's been a lot of wild dreams. It's just been very activated. How about yourself?
And to share, if you don't mind sharing, you have Cancer rising. So lunations are they always kind of felt viscerally for you? Is eclipse season always kind of felt viscerally for you?
Yeah, I mean, eclipses in particular have always hit pretty hard. This year I am in a Cancer perfection year, so like first house perfection year. So every lunation has pretty much hit, and then just the eclipses amp it up another level.
Yeah, so the moon is like your not only your ascendant lord, but your time lord for the year. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I have, as many listeners know, I have the moon in my first, and I feel lunations pretty viscerally as well, typically, or eclipses pretty viscerally as well. There's always interesting things happening for me around eclipses. Not always terribly difficult, but just interesting. And for example, I'm about to have the South Node eclipse. The moon and the sun will both be in Libra with the South Node, and my midheaven is there. And someone asked me to speak on their channel on Instagram last week, and Catherine Urban, a past guest on this podcast, asked me to speak for an event they're doing next week. So it's very like being present in the world in a way that is new for me. So it feels kind of apt in that way.
That's exciting.
Yeah, I'm really excited for it. I'm really excited. I am speaking about my exalted Jupiter in the eighth that rules my ascendant. The whole panel is about like chart rulership. So different people are going to be talking about their ascendant ruler. And I feel really honored because there are so many amazing astrologers that I'll be speaking with, several of which have been on this podcast. And so I feel just really honored to be able to be a part of it. Well, cool. Can you give us a short intro to yourself and your practice, Whitney?
Yeah, so I primarily use like Hellenistic methods in my astrology, with Dr. Ali Alomi bringing forth a lot more of the like medieval Islamic traditions and techniques. I've started integrating those. I've really learned formally from Jason Fleming and Sam Reynolds, and then done a bunch of like courses and workshops from Chris Brennan, Lisa Scheim, Austin Coppock, Demetra George, Maya Rourke, Diana Rose Harper, and then Oscar Diaz's work on fixed stars has also kind of influenced mine. So there's, like I said, primarily Hellenistic, but there's also some animistic things. There's also kind of just a blend of like my personal thoughts that I'm working
Mm-hmm.
on top of now doing a master's in cultural astronomy and astrology at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. So bringing in now like a more scholarly approach to astrology in general.
That's amazing. And you finished your first year in that, and you said that you wrote some really interesting papers related to fate.
Yeah, so I was able to interview some folks in the metaphysical community about fate and what I'm calling fate management,
Mm-hmm.
where I'm asking general questions around, people's cosmologies. What do they believe about the world and the universe, and just, how things work.
Mm,
And then asking around the sources of fate, and then asking, okay, you have these sets of beliefs, how do you manage those? If
right.
you believe that fate is a thing, how do you then go through life trying to adjust it?
Mm-hmm.
And that work really kind of helped formalize like my own perspective, which is a term like Egyptian fatalism, which comes from Nemesius of Emesa. And I learned it from Suzanne Bobstein's work, Determinism and Freedom in Stoic Philosophy. So it's this idea that like, yes, there's fate, and yes, there's a predetermined outcome to things, but through prayer or action of some kind, you can kind of navigate that. So it's been an interesting process to talk to people and like just understand their thoughts on it. And I'm really hoping to continue that work.
Awesome. Yeah. And you made a note in our show notes about differentiating between fatalism and determinism. And so I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on that, because I think in the astrological community, we talk a lot about determinism, but not necessarily fatalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from, my first impression is those things could be synonymous, but I would love to hear how you distinguish between them.
Yeah, we do really tend to hear people use them synonymously. And up until I was researching this paper, I was doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I came across a really good article by a man called Robert C. Solomon called On Fate and Fatalism. Um, and he really took the time to distinguish the two, where fate is, a predetermined outcome, and
Mm,
determinism is actually saying that the result occurred because of your actions. So it's that question of agency.
mm,
Fate says this thing is going to happen no matter what you do, and determinism says, well, the thing will happen because you did or because you acted. Uh,
mm,
and I really think people these days are far more comfortable with that idea of determinism, that, I have my fate in my hands, or, the things that I do are what determine the outcome. But I think with this Hellenistic astrology coming, more to the foreground in the last 20 years, we do see maybe more of an exploration around something closer to fatalism.
yeah. It's interesting to think about the Stoic foundations or intersections with Hellenistic astrology, because that was a popular philosophical thread kind of at that point among several other philosophical threads. But the idea of Stoicism is basically this concept. I mean, to kind of simplify it, is this concept of fatalism, and that the thing to do is to learn how to accept, like amor fati, learn how to accept and love your fate rather than, striving or attempting to change what is fated. And it's interesting what you bring up about fatalism and determinism, because it seems like the definition that this person is using for determinism is closer to free will than fate. And we, I think, tend to think about determinism more as fate than free will. So
Mm-hmm.
is that a misunderstanding, or how do you think determinism and free will interplay?
I mean, I think that brings us back to this idea of Egyptian fatalism, where there is kind of that predetermined outcome, but rather than saying um, there's only one absolute outcome, it occurs along a spectrum.
Mm,
So, maybe you're fated to do a thing or to go somewhere, but the determinism, like the action part of it, comes in when we're talking about how easy is your road there? What choices did you make? Did you go willingly to your fate, or did you,
mm,
fight tooth and nail and try to change it and really have a bad time of it? Um, I mean, even Valens says it's not possible to appeal the decrees of fate, but you can weaken the evil to some extent. So it's like, yeah, the fate will occur, but you can kind of shift it to some extent.
Yeah. I'm reminded of an episode of the astrology podcast that I listened to as part of the horary course I took with Chris Brennan, or am taking because he's in the process of revamping it. But he did an episode with T. Susan Chang and divination, like an episode on divination, for lack of my memory not allowing me to access what the title was. But she talks about in that episode the idea of like sympathetic magic. So she's a tarot practitioner and she draws the tarot, the tower, as like the card of the day. And then she said that she walked down her stairs backwards as a way to kind of embody that energy. And I think that that's kind of at play in what you're saying here, where there could be like an archetypal signification for the way things will manifest in your life, but that doesn't mean there's a specific manifestation of that. And there's some kind of room in there to choose how a particular thing could manifest.
Right, exactly. So it's kind of that whole thing, like if we take it back to eclipses where there would be like a fool for the day would sit on the throne, and it's like, oh, something happened to a king, but it wasn't our actual king. Or even like if we bring it down to our everyday level, choosing a more constructive outlet for some of that energy could be a way to mitigate it. Do we know for sure? Probably not. Nobody's omniscient, but it is, at least for me, comforting to have a sense of like there is something I can do. I'm not just being thrown down a hill by fate or the gods or whoever.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally relate with that as well. Yeah, I just want to share a little bit about how we know each other. So we don't know each other super well. This is the first time we're having a conversation face to face, kind of in person, not in person, over Zoom. But yeah, I was just curious if we met on Twitter and we've interacted quite a bit. We have some mutual kind of friends that we talk with. I was curious if you had any other comments about that.
Yeah, so I mean, like you said, we like met on Twitter. And then I really admired the work that you had done on Rob Hand's comments on the Lot of Fortune in the charts of astrologers, because it was one of those like strange pieces of discourse where people like really had their identities come out, like I am an astrologer, or people really felt threatened that they weren't able to claim astrologer as part of their identity or who they were. And it was just, I felt like you brought like a really good kind of balancing part to the conversation. If I recall, you had a partner in that as well.
Yeah, I worked with Mo on that. So I interviewed a few other people as well who kind of gave their thoughts on it. And then Mo, I did the research with her, where we looked at basically like 100 charts of famous astrologers to see how, the significations that Rob Hand talked about manifested in their charts.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing with that is I feel like it kind of exposed how maybe a lot of folks think there's only one way to be an astrologer, which is you're practicing, you're getting paid, you're doing readings. I am not getting paid to do readings right now, but I still consider myself an astrologer. I'm reading charts, I'm looking at stars, I'm doing, research. So yeah, like I said, it was just good to have some of that balance, I think, especially on Twitter at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And yeah, I'm glad that people got something out of that, because it was such a random specific comment that I think we all kind of latched onto in a way. And I just loved that I had the opportunity to explore that and that people seem to get something out of it. So I always appreciate like feedback on that.
That was good work.
Yeah, thank you. All right. When you think back to your childhood, what was your relationship to the moon, or what's one memory that comes to mind in relation to her?
I was just always looking for the moon. Like this draw toward the sky and towards space. And at one point I really wanted to be an astronaut and like physically go to the moon, which I don't know, like ascendant ruler being the moon in my fourth house. So it's like, let's make a home on the moon. It's like quite literal interpretation of it. But I did a book report on Macy Jemison, who was the first Black woman to travel into space. I did Space Academy and like led mission control. So there was
That's
like
so cool.
it was, oh my God, it was so much fun. I don't know why they put me in charge, but it's Mars. I'm just gonna say it's Mars.
Hmm.
But just the idea of being in space was always something that I loved. And then just the moon was the most approachable part of that, because you don't always know the constellation. Like I can always find Orion. Um,
Hmm.
but as a child, it was like, well, the moon was always just right there, and
Mm.
just so easy to witness and to watch and contemplate. So that's where we started.
Mm. That's amazing. I love that. I love like you're the second guest now who's talked about wanting to be an astronaut as a kid, which is not something I necessarily identify with, but it's really cool to see how that fascination with space like happened for some so early,
Mhm.
and how it, you speak to Mars on your MC, how like how action, like, you really kind of like took action around that, as much as like a kid can have agency to, take those kind of 10th house actions.
Mhm. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
So what does the moon mean to you today, and why do you think it's important that we focus on the moon when we talk about astrology?
So for me, again, with my natal Mars on the MC, it's also with Rahu. So there's
Mm,
just so much focus on just this constant achievement or constant growth, or like it's, the head of the dragon is always eating and it's always hungry. And that just kind of lives
mm,
in me. So having the moon opposite to kind of counterbalance it, but then just in general, brings that, I guess, recognition that we can't always be in harvest. We can't always be, at the pinnacle of success and always accomplishing. Like things have to go in a cycle of waxing and waning. Things are not always going to be consistent. If we try to go around like a rocket and just continually go, then you're going to run out of fuel. So having
mm,
space and giving yourself grace to have that kind of um, allowance to be inconsistent, or to be in a dark moon phase, or to come home and just be like a little seed and rest for a little bit.
mm,
That has just been very helpful as a reminder for me. But then just thinking about like tracking my dreams. So I look
mm,
around and see what sign is the moon in, and where is that in my chart. So I know that I'll have more dreams or more vivid dreams when the moon is in the cadence signs, which is,
mm,
obviously the ninth and the third, we can talk about dreams. But I also have Jupiter in the ninth. So it's like just a very exaggerated dream life, which the
mm,
moon activates. So somewhat philosophical, somewhat practical, but just thinking about it astrologically, it is, the fastest body, and paying attention to what's happening and what gets triggered is just a really accessible way to, deal with astrology.
right. To do astrology. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's super true. And I think, as I've talked about on past episodes with guests, I think shifting perhaps, or like balancing the lunar and solar, I feel like is so important, to give people more of a opportunity or space to live more seasonally, which I think kind of focusing on the lunar can give us, because the solar is like so, this consistent, always shining kind of thing. And when we think about the moon, we think about change and waxing and waning, and we've quote unquote created the society where it's like you can get bananas 365 days a year, even though like there's not a lot of seasonality. And again, I maybe need to focus on like eating more seasonally. I think that's one thing that comes up for me, which could be like a good kind of uh lunar remediation for me, is to get more in touch with the food that grows locally and seasonally in my area.
Mhm.
But yeah, I love that emphasis.
I love local eating. So again, moon in the fourth, like just nourishing myself with locally
Mm,
grown produce, even things that I grow myself in my backyard or exchange with my neighbors. Um, that has been like really good, like just good. It just feels good. I don't know. That's one of the things that I
mhm,
can't explain, but food
mhm.
grown locally, bought from local farmers, for me, it just tastes better. It feels better. So I do personally recommend that if you're looking for a way to connect.
Yeah, and also I feel like the moon's associations with the third, bartering with your neighbors or trading with your neighbors feels like really fitting for that
Exactly.
as a way to kind of build community and get the things that you need to support your life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what does the sign of Libra mean to you? And how do considerations of myth, if they do, play into your understanding and experience of both the sign of Libra and the moon?
Yeah, so Libra, it's one of those ones that like I get annoyed when people are like, "Oh, it's a seesaw." Like they make it sound like a whiny seesaw,
Mm-hmm.
and there's just so much more to it than that. And especially as I've been doing research over the summer, and I got hold of Neugebauer and Parker's Egyptian astronomical texts, and those have just been like totally mind blowing, very exciting.
Mm,
But there's a note that in Papyrus Carlsberg 9, Libra was called the horizon. So
mm,
it wasn't the scales, it was a horizon. And we see that kind of symbolism in the actual, like in our current glyph.
right.
Um, so that really got me.
Kind of looks like the sun rising or setting with the two lines and the kind of bump on top
Right,
of it. Yeah.
right. I think it would be rising because it was a very, Egyptian concept. It was like the rising sun was everything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if you think of it as a horizon, you think of it as a sun, which is ironic to think of it as a sun because the sun is not at its best in Libra.
Right.
But if we get away from this, seesaw of a scale, then we can think more about duality. You can have duality on a spectrum where we're meeting, you know, halfway rather than forcing a choice of one or the other. We can think of it in terms of cycles as well, day and night, seasons, all of that. So, if we look at Libra in the sense of it being cardinal, it's also the inexorability of what's coming. The day is always going to start. Like you might have the
Mm-hmm.
Sunday scaries, or you might be dreading the next day, but it's coming.
Mm-hmm.
You might be having the day of your life, but it will end
Mm,
eventually. So, you know, Libra can be about thinking of what actions are needed to meet that change. Because thinking, it's an air sign. We're getting more cerebral out of all of
mm,
the cardinal signs there. So, yes, Virgo is the mutable sign. So Virgo is going to be more about the change itself, managing the change, but then we need Libra to step in and make that next step.
mm-hmm.
Um, so you've got a blend there of like the Venusian, you've got the Saturnian. We're making connections, but then we're also like establishing the foundations and the boundaries to that.
Mm. It's interesting for me to notice what kinds of thoughts come up during a particular sun season. I felt like during Cancer season, I was thinking a lot about death and meaning, and it's my eighth house, and my ascendant ruler is there. And the topic that's come to mind a lot, which feels weird because I'm actually not a big fan of Ernest Hemingway, but the title of his book, The Sun Also Rises, the sun sets, but the sun also rises. And that feels applicable to what you're talking about in relation to the Egyptian image of Libra as the horizon and as the place where the sun rises.
Mhm.
And it just feels like a very hopeful image for me in particular, because I guess I'm going through a lot of changes in my life right now. But it's just interesting to see what kind of commonal a month long commonalities of thought come up for me with sun seasons in particular. And I suppose it's fitting with the sun's association as the mind or what have you.
Yeah.
Um, okay.
Do we want to talk myth?
Yeah, if you'd like to.
Yeah, sure. I mean, because I don't want to throw out the idea of the scales entirely because obviously we have the whole weighing of the heart in,
Mm,
Egyptian mythology. Um, so it's still present, but if we're thinking about the moon in Libra in particular, we have Jehuti, who's also called Thoth, and he's, standing there at the scales, taking notes, taking judgment. So we do have, this kind of, we were talking about cycles. So there is a cycle wherein there is judgment, wherein there are consequences, so we have Saturn coming in again.
mm,
But I've always loved that kind of aspect of like thinking about the moon in Libra. And then you had mentioned like hope as, the sun rising.
Mm,
And again, I'm thinking of ancient Egypt. It was a moment of triumph for the sun to rise.
right.
It was you have triumphed over darkness. The country has, done the correct things, and the world can continue another day. So
Mm,
I think it takes a step beyond hope and into this, just really triumphant and almost aggressive kind of like success and aggression is,
celebratory almost.
yeah, well, it's
Yeah.
definitely celebratory.
Yeah.
But if we look at, so again, like I'm reading the Nous of the Decades right now, and there's conversation about how the decans were originally brought into magic as like not only protective but also like defensive and actively attacking enemies. So
Mm,
the sun rising into a new decan would be, okay, we have a new protector for this period.
right.
So I think people do Libra a disservice when they say like, oh, it's wishy-washy. Oh, we're just gonna, they can't decide. They don't want to do anything. It's like, well, we're trying to decide how not to destroy you, maybe.
Mm, yeah.
um, or even like with that idea of protection, we have Khonsu, who's, decider of the lifespan and this expeller of demons, and protecting people who travel by night. So that's a god who has a falcon head, so it has these very solar appearance until you look up and he's wearing the moon on his head.
Mm,
So bringing these things together, I don't know, with Libra again, just thinking about how it's the place of the sun's fall, but then like I have the moon there, bringing
mhm,
in those kind of dichotomies. Okay, we're going to be a Libra today. Bringing in like dichotomies around power and the use of power, or um, protection, has
mhm.
always been kind of interesting for me.
Yeah, not to be repetitive, but I'm reminded again of this von Clausewitz quote, which I mentioned in the last Libra Moon episode, which feels very Libran of war is politics by other means,
Mm-hmm.
is his famous quote. And it's just interesting to see all of the kind of world leaders with strong Libra placements, whether it be Libra rising or what have you. Um, and yeah, I think of Saturn exalted in Libra as very much like the statesman, like the elder statesman. I know Jupiter gets a lot of the natural significations of law and diplomacy, and Zeus famously kind of like ruling by committee or what have you. But there does feel strong elements of the elder statesman with Saturn's exaltation in Libra, which feels kind of fitting here.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'm curious if you could share a little bit about. I'm reminded of going to Norwalk in 2022 and attending Jason Hawley's sun lecture, and he talked about, I believe it has Egyptian origins, of the sun setting. You talked about like the triumph of the sunrise, and the idea of the sun setting is that it starts this kind of epic battle
Mm-hmm.
through the night. And so I feel like that adds a little bit of context to the triumph of the sunrise. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as and this is kind of pulling into where we get some of the names for the houses. So, you know, the seventh and eighth, we're going down into the underworld. We have the gates of the underworld, going down into it, and then coming back up. We have the gates of Hades in the second, going up into
Mm-hmm.
the first. So as we're going down into the underworld, there's this solar bark, and the sun god is riding in it, and being attacked by like Apep, or who's this massive snake who's going to eat the world and end everything and plunge it into darkness. Um, and everybody, all these gods on this boat have to fight it off. So they basically spend the whole night cycling through, like fighting for their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it actually brought me to a theory around why the lot of necessity is kind of associated with all of these like really negative things like
Mm.
conflicts and crime, or like whatever, all the kind of bad add challenging
Mm-hmm.
significations of
Mm-hmm.
necessity, where
Right.
um,
Quote unquote yoke of necessity, which I'm reminded of Sam Reynolds' talk or YouTube video about Libra, and like the glyph of Libra also being symbolic of a yoke as well as scales.
yeah, but we have necessity as Mercury's law. If we're looking at Paulus, it's a
Mm-hmm.
Mercury's law.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Mercury was Seth in ancient Egypt. So this god of war and this god of chaos. So Mercury as a morning star was a good thing. Seth is now in the front of the boat helping to fight off, the enemies, the terrible snake.
Mm.
Mercury as an evening star was behind the boat. He's not involved in it.
Mm.
So this kind of brought some ideas around, ooh, is Mercury going to be, the good guy today, or is Mercury going to be like chasing us with a spear? Um,
Mm.
so a lot of these things that I think people attribute to Mars in a lot of ways, I think originally they had more to do with Mercury.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah. And just to kind of contrast the lot of Mars is called courage, whereas the lot of Mercury is called necessity. And courage typically has positive connotations in not only our culture, but Hellenistic cultures as well. I'm not sure about Egyptian, but yeah, do you have any kind of thoughts on that? Or if not, it's okay. I feel like it kind of illustrates the point, the difference between Mercury and Mars.
Yeah, I mean, Mars was represented by a face of Horus. So there's kind of multiple versions of Horus. Um, Mars had one, Jupiter had one, Saturn had one. So
Mm.
Mars was Horus the Red. Um, so we still see like a good, and Horus is typically the good guy, strong in magic. So we still have good things associated with Mars. Like, yeah, I'm not going to be like a Mars apologist and say like, oh no, Mars is all good.
Yeah.
Um, but like you said, there is that element of courage. There is that element of, wow, we're in a really hard place. We need to dig deep and, fight through. Um, whereas the real threat was this kind of chaos. It was this star that was going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And, you
Mm-hmm.
know, the most like the one that goes retrograde most often, um, that looked chaotic. That did not align with the order of the sky, the order of things. So that was the real danger, not necessarily, Mars, but this star that is not moving
Mm-hmm.
in its normal path. And I know like Mars has the more irregular orbit, but um, I think that's why we do see like Mercury being more threatening, because it's going back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to think about how like inconsistency is more threatening than the threat of like aggression that can come with Mars or what have you.
Yeah, it can be. And it's like, and I do think we have to be careful there, because um, when people get kind of stuck in a headspace of, well, better the devil I know, they can
Mm,
stay in situations that aren't good for them. Um,
absolutely.
so it's on some level, we do need to embrace that inconsistency and maybe not see the good in it, but just understand that for there to be growth, or for there to be resolution of some kind, we do need to embrace it. But it is uncomfortable.
Right. Yeah, we need to embrace the duality of life that Mercury can embody quite
Mm-hmm.
often. Amazing. So what does it mean for you for your moon to be in Libra, or for the moon to be in Libra in general?
For me, I guess, I mean, even in general, because Libra is a cardinal sign, where, again, we have the keywords of like initiation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm always thinking about moonrise. So, we're clearing the horizon and there's a new passage, not a new day, not a new night, because you see the moon day or night.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a day chart with the moon below the horizon. My sister's a day chart with the moon above the horizon. So it's like you're still going to have the duality of a cycle and a passage, and seeing it and not seeing it, but um, it's like we were talking at the beginning, where it's not as regular as we see with the sun. Um, so you see that kind of irregularity with Libra moons in being a little bit of a chameleon sometimes.
Mm.
So like speaking for myself, um, I've traveled to 4 different continents and been mistaken as a local on all of them.
Mm,
Um,
it's incredible.
it's a very strange experience. Um, Part of it is that I make an effort to adapt my appearance, behavior, speech. I try to, I'm not going to say like assimilate fully, but really make an effort to, and it's not blending in, but it is just trying to like respect where I
Yeah.
am and um, move through the space in a way that does not invite conflict.
Hmm.
And then it's,
In a way that's kind of reverential.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it is, or at least respectful. And the idea is, to have a better experience for everyone. So here's where we see the more Venusian side of Libra coming in,
Hmm.
um, where we want to have a pleasant experience for ourselves and those around us. But then we have the Saturnian in, well, there are rules to how pleasant experiences happen.
Right.
It can't be everyone out for themselves. It can't be the stereotypical, loud American dressed not correctly,
Hmm.
um, turning up and expecting everyone to adapt to them. Like, no, we need to have a give and take. We need to follow certain rules according to where we are.
Yeah, there's an etiquette to this that needs to be followed.
Etiquette, I think, is a really good Libra word
Hmm.
because it's
Yeah.
about, that aesthetic and pleasant experience, but again, there are rules to it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, and I want to kind of emphasize this point about that you make in our document of it not being, well, I guess you kind of spoke about this, but it's not like a fakeness. It's a desire to adapt to like meet that etiquette or be respectful to this different cultural context.
Right. So, like, when I went to Egypt, I did not, put a scarf on because I wasn't asked to. They know that I'm
Hmm.
foreign eventually, as soon as I, speak. But I did cover my shoulders. I covered, my knees and really had the best time. It was great.
Mm.
You hear all these stories about, oh, don't go to certain countries because, you're going to be treated a certain kind of way. And it's like, well, if you go to these countries and you're respectful,
Yeah, it will take you a
then
long way.
right.
Hmm.
But if we're talking about how you act in certain situations, I do think that like the Libra moon being out of sect, so like Libra's a day sign. It's,
Hmm.
so you put the moon in a day sign and you're already like, oh, I don't know how to act here. Like, so there, there's like already you're having to think about it more. So,
Hmm.
um,
Is it fair to say that embodiment feels a little bit complex?
yeah, yeah, definitely. And if we think about it, the moon in Taurus, like, ooh, you feel like that just
Hmm.
feels good. You know how to
Hmm.
feel, like you know how to be and you know how to feel.
Settled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just comfortable. So it's like, yeah, Libra's still a Venusian sign, but it's her guest home.
Hmm.
It's somewhere that she goes to entertain, or maybe the decoration is different, or it's not a place of, I think, instinctive comfort for the moon,
Hmm.
where you can just be. There's more thinking about how to be.
Hmm. Mm. Yeah, two things come to mind. The first is that it's interesting with the moon in any of the cardinal signs because there's either a square or an opposition to her domicile of Cancer, which adds an element of tension, perhaps, or an element of some kind of challenge.
Mhm.
And so I feel like that can kind of speak to that in a way. The initiation, if we think about cardinal signs as initiatory, the initiation that the moon wants to do is perhaps more symbolic of the water element. So emotional initiation, or like the impulse to nourish with Cancer. And so it's interesting with Libra, there's this kind of initiatory element that's slightly different, um, more social, perhaps. And it's interesting to think about Cancer as a social sign as well, but how the air element is a little bit different from the water element,
Mhm.
uh, in terms of like nourishment and interpersonal relationships.
And I do think that Cancer has that nourishing um like component, but I do also, and this might be like Mars overcoming my Cancer, but
Mm.
there's a very protective element to it too. So
Oh,
it's,
absolutely.
nourishment or protection as nourishment. And we come back to Khonsu, who is, the protector of those who travel by night, but then is also associated as a moon god with um, like pregnancy or sowing crops or like, bringing things to fullness. So
Fertility.
yeah, in a way,
Mm-hmm. Is that
or
incorrect? Is there like a different emphasis on fertility in Egyptian
um, I
culture?
don't, I don't know that it's different. And I need to read up more on like actual, because there were actual like fertility
Right.
mostly goddesses.
Yeah.
Um, this is more about bringing things to fullness.
Mm.
Women coming to the or pregnant people coming to the fullness of pregnancy,
Mm-hmm.
um, crops coming to fullness. Um, so it's also that Hansu is the decider of the lifespan. So it's you're coming to fullness, and then you're coming to end.
Right.
So there's the moon. Yeah, it is definitely nourishing, but there is also elements in there of protection and elements in there of endings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are you comfortable sharing where Libra falls in your chart and how that impacts the experience of your moon?
Yep. Yeah. So that's in my fourth. It is on the IC and it's co-present the South Node. So in that opposition with Mars. And generally, like, I guess the first thing that always comes to mind is I have a really good relationship with my parents. We're very close.
Mm-hmm.
Probably talking to them almost every day.
Mm-hmm.
But like with Mars coming in, it's like, ooh, short visits or, being cut off from home sometimes. But also thinking about, you know, Moon being in Libra, so we have this kind of aesthetic influence. I really, really need to be in like a comfortable and beautiful home to feel at my
Mm-hmm.
best.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I'm like, I don't know, I just start getting like really kind of mentally unsettled.
Mm.
And I don't really like letting loads of people come over because it's just a very personal space. I mean, it's literally the ruler of my ascendant, myself, in
Mm-hmm.
my home. Um, but that being said, like dinner parties are fun. So um inviting like selected guests.
Mm-hmm.
So like I don't know, I think that's a very Venus Saturn connection there. And just having people say like, oh, it feels so good here. And I'm like, oh, okay. This is
Mm-hmm.
actually kind of nice. Like I don't have to keep everybody out. Um and then I actually currently live on my moon IC line. So if anybody does like
Oh, wow.
astrocartography or anything like that, it is the longest place I've lived in one location. So I've held the
Mm-hmm.
same address for like years now. And it's just such a huge contrast to when I was living in London and I was living on my Uranus IC line. And we
Mm.
moved like every 6 months or so.
Mm-hmm.
I think the
Mm-hmm.
longest we stayed in one place was like just over a year.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like you have me with my little moon just wanting to be like nurtured and at home and
Right.
comfortable, moving. And then like
Mm-hmm.
just bizarre things happened. Somebody climbed up a lamp post and broke into the apartment below us. And it was
Wow.
like, what is happening?
Yeah, that sounds very like Uranus IC with just like what is happening to my home. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, this feeling of kind of like an intense, uh, weird thing happening,
Mhm.
that kind of throws off your sense of groundedness or sense of home.
Right. And, for a long time, that and just various other events in my life, going back to childhood, just really made me feel like I don't have a home.
Mm.
So, being cut off from home, with the Mars opposition or just the moon itself being inconstant, having an inconstant living situation. Um, so, being able to live in a place that feels so viscerally like home has been just really healing.
Mm.
It's a thing I rejected for a long time because was like, oh, that's not for me. I don't have a home. But it's like, no,
Mm,
you got to follow the astrology here. Like you have a home, you just need to make it.
yeah. It seems like mm, it seems like that could be a thing. Exaltation ruler of your ascendant in your ninth,
Mhm.
where it's like I feel more at home on the road. I feel more at home traveling far away.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's really interesting with your nodes in this fourth, tenth axis, where there being like this need for balance, perhaps between, um, like home and career, or privacy. You
Mhm.
said like not inviting many people into your kind of sanctuary,
Mhm.
and the visibility in the world that comes in the 10th.
Yeah. No, definitely. It's been a really long journey toward understanding that I don't have to share everything.
Mm-hmm.
And Diana Rose Harper actually has a really good workshop called Work Your Angles.
Yeah.
That was, really breaks things down, but really helped me see like, oh, wait a minute, I'm allowed to hold this back for me.
Mm-hmm.
But it is just like with Mars as the lord of the chart and the moon as the ascendant ruler, constantly bumping heads and on different agendas. And then you throw the nodes in, and yeah, it's been a journey.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify, Work Your Angles is a workshop that Diana did where you kind of take your ascendant and you take your MC, and it's for like, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but it's for like how to appear in the world, or how would you describe that workshop?
Yeah, so I think it's around not only how you appear, but how to present yourself authentically to you and to really like use your strengths.
Mm,
So this thing, like for me personally, the benefit came from you see everybody's lives on social media. They're showing you their homes, they're showing you their children, they're showing you like here's my day. And I'm like, okay, so that's what I have to do in order to,
mm,
satisfy Mars's agenda and be seen.
right,
And it was like, well, no, where is your moon? Your moon is in the exact opposite part. So
right.
what are like that's where I started setting boundaries and saying, no, I am going to hold this back for me. I'm not going to show people, where's my writing nook anymore. I'm not going to show people,
Mm-hmm.
you know, here's the inside. Like, why does everybody need to see the inside of people's homes? I don't know. Maybe this is
Mm-hmm.
the moon in the fourth coming out again, but I'm like,
Yeah.
stay out of people's homes.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. It's interesting too when you think about the fourth as like home, or like your actual house or family, parents. Um, but you can also look at it, I guess, a little bit more psychologically as just like the most private place, the
Right,
most kind of internal place. And it feels fitting that you want to kind of keep that to yourself.
right, right. Like, I don't know. I just get anxiety about like
Mm-hmm.
I'll take pictures of like outside. I'm sure somebody
Yeah.
very clever could still find me, but um yeah, like my moon is 2 degrees away from my IC. Like I have
Mm-hmm.
to have something for myself.
Right. And I love that what you've been posting a lot about on social media lately, like since we've been following each other, is like your blacksmithing practice, for lack of a better term, where you're like making knives and stuff, which feels just very Mars on the MC in general. But that feels like a thing, looking at your chart, that is a lot more comfortable being shown.
Right. And that's actually a really good point. That is something where I've learned that planets don't make you do things. So, people saying like, oh, I'm like that because of my Mars. No, you're not. You're like that because you choose to be like that. Mars just,
Mm,
predisposes or opens energy or, something. It doesn't make you do that.
right.
At the same time, acknowledging that there is a planet, it doesn't have to be, Mars in the MC. It could be any planet that is very visible like that. Um, it's going to need attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times, we're really made to feel bad for wanting attention of some kind. It doesn't necessarily have to be, the attention of the masses on social media, but if you have a planet in the 10th on the MC, whole sign houses, the MC will change signs, but wherever it is, um, that planet is going to need to be seen. So that's kind of the compromise that I make with Mars is,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you want to be seen, I will show the world the arts of Mars that I am, engaging in.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to work with that energy of Mars and kind of uh give Mars what it needs, not only the action that is kind of inherently associated with Mars, but the visibility that comes with being on the MC in the 10th house.
Right. I mean, it's better than what I was doing, which was getting on Twitter and shouting at strangers. That was not it was
Yeah.
not an effective way to engage with people. It was not an effective way to deal with Mars, and it just left me feeling more and more angry. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, that's not healthy for anybody. It's not healthy for me. It's not healthy for who I'm arguing with or shouting at. Um, so again, like Mars does not make you do things. The moon does not make you do things. It opens a door
Right.
or it provides roads, and you get to choose how you walk that road.
Yeah, absolutely. I relate to that a lot. And just to kind of emphasize the point that you made earlier about home and, the very Libran thing of being sensitive to environment, and
Mhm.
with it being your fourth house, being very sensitive to how your home is arranged or constructed or what have you. I have conjunction in the first house. And I very much need to, I mentioned this on the last episode, I very much need to do exercise, like basically every day, or I don't feel right, in the same ways that, like you said, you don't feel totally right if your home is a particular way, disorganized or not aesthetically pleasing to you. And again, it's not that, uh, yeah, it's just an energy that I have to work with, and like I don't feel victimized by that. I just have to be aware of it and be attentive to it, because it has certain requirements. It has certain things that necessitate within me. And so I have to take particular actions, and, uh, but it's not an excuse to act in any kind of way.
Yeah, it's good insight.
All right, wonderful. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about your Venus placement, the domicile ruler of Libra, and or your Saturn placement, the exaltation ruler in your chart?
Yeah, so they are conjoined in the Sagittarius sixth house. If you attended NORWAC 2023 or you got Austin Kopic's lecture on planetary triplets, everything he said about Mars, Saturn, and Venus is true for me. So, I mean, that's where I do really enjoy kind of like the harshness of Hellenistic astrology sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
where it gives recognition to the more difficult aspects. So, like, for example, one of the things that, if I recall correctly, Austin said was that it's the worst party that Venus has ever been to. And it's like, you know what? Yeah, it kind of is, because she's stuck
Mm-hmm.
between these two, like, the big, heavy, stern guy and
Mm-hmm.
the hothead.
Yeah.
They don't know how to act. They're doing their own things.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, Saturn is over there kind of slowing everything down. And so, yeah, I really resonated with that lecture. But the weird setup with my chart is that, like, so Venus is enclosed and then Saturn is bona fide, because they're both square Jupiter in the
Mm-hmm.
ninth. So it's like this and then my sixth is the 10th from fortune. So it's like, it on the surface it looks really messy, but then it kind of works out.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like that comes through the moon, where it's like on the surface everything looks like a mess, but it's like, actually it's working. Let's just roll with that.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah. And so can you tell us a little bit about fortune houses and like how the mess actually looks very different when you look at things from that perspective?
Yeah, this is an area that I'm like increasingly interested in with
Mm-hmm.
like the fate studies. Um, but if we think of the lot of fortune, the lot of the moon as this second ascendant, and kind of rotate the chart. So like if my fortune is in the ninth house, we rotate the chart to make the ninth house the first.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that puts Sagittarius on the 10th house, 10th whole sign house. So what looks like, the second worst house in the chart actually becomes the best or the second best, depending on which, system you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they do have that connection with their ruler. So you have this blended situation of, ooh, the sixth house is really difficult, but that hard work and that struggle will pay off somehow. You
Mm.
can't see how, but it will.
Mm-hmm. But that hard work is like almost required.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. And that again, it's the beautiful thing about astrology, that it's good to know that,
Mhm.
it's good to have that knowledge and then put that into action and gain the information of, okay, I did the hard work and it worked. So, you're, I think, more inclined to do the hard work the next time, because you know that chances are good that it could be fruitful.
It's, I'm not gonna lie, there are days where I'm like, no, I don't want to do the hard work. All I've done is work hard. All I've done
Mm-hmm.
is, build the foundations and do other people's work and, just work, 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 work. All, sometimes that's all you can see. Um, but then, when the payoff does come, it's like, oh, okay, that's nice. Okay, I guess it was worth it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's not necessarily that I'm going into it accepting that I have to do it. It's that it's like I almost don't have a choice.
Right.
So it's like,
Mm,
well, you might as well just get it done.
right.
I guess that's
Yeah.
acceptance in a way, but it doesn't feel like it. It's just like, okay, fine.
Yeah, it's like that thin line between, or maybe not a thin line, but it's like acceptance and acting out of acceptance is very different from acting from a place of desire.
Yes.
The
Very
actions
much.
could look the same, but the motivation is different. And that's a very real thing, I think.
Hmm. No, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about sect and how that plays out in your chart with
Yeah.
the various placements?
Yeah. So I mentioned, Libra being a day sign, Moon being a night planet in a day sign. But that's pretty much the story of my whole chart in one way or another. So, like, not only the Moon, but also Mars and Venus are in diurnal signs. Jupiter is in his night home.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a day chart with Saturn below the horizon. Mercury is westerly, so like a evening star in a day chart, and then the Sun is in Aquarius. So it's like nobody is necessarily where they would prefer to be.
Mm,
Um, most of the planets are in some way mitigated, most of them,
yeah.
not all. But it's, there's this still very keen awareness of like, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. This isn't quite how I'm supposed to act.
Mm,
So it kind of raises these questions around, how do you behave or how do you be seen? So like day planets in nocturnal signs, they're asking, how do you express yourself or how do you shine with no spotlight?
mm,
Um, night planets in diurnal signs are like, well, I'm exposed. What do I do now? In
mm,
Mars's case, we act out. Um,
right.
and then there's like this kind of push pull between the natural expression and then like what's actually available. So I really loved, that you had been looking at sect already as part of this podcast because it really made me stop and think about that and think about like what does that mean to be in sect or what does that mean to um I guess be in a sign or be in a place on the horizon or above or below it that agrees with you and feels like, and I'm going to bring it back to home,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like what does it mean to feel at home in a way?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting looking at your chart, because I feel like there are a lot of similarities in our charts in some ways, like similar Moon Mars configuration, similar kind of situation where, yeah, I have the Moon and Mars in a fire sign above the horizon. I have Jupiter in a water sign, Saturn in an earth sign. Um, Venus in an air sign, and like Mercury is an evening star and it's in Capricorn, so it's like the only planet that's kind of like in a sign that aligns with its sect.
Gotcha.
Um, so it is really interesting to kind of consider it, and of course thought about it before, but I haven't necessarily thought about it in the way that you're framing it. So that's definitely something I'll have to think more about. The other thing that comes to mind too is I'm reminded of my episode with Gray about moon sign in concert with moon phase, with lunar phase. And it's interesting to, we have like somewhat similar moon, not super similar because mine is like super balsamic, but yours is kind of like in that last trimester. What's the term? The last kind of like trine relationship to the sun where it's waning and disseminating. But we both are in diurnal signs, our moon. And so I'm interested to hear how phase kind of modulates this external diurnal place that the moon is in for you.
Yeah, I mean, so you're absolutely right. It is waning gibbous, disseminating moon phase. And you had mentioned earlier around like the sun and thought, and I have, the moon in that like fairly tight trine with the sun. So it's like everything I think has to be shared.
Mm.
And it has to be shared immediately, like, moon in Libra immediately, like now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I don't want to think about how I have to do that, or, it frustrates me, the idea that I have to like protect my work, or that somebody might copy it, or, something. Because I think it might have been Oscar who I had a reading with, and he said like, oh, you can go sit in the forum. And I was like, yeah, you
Mm.
know? um so it's like I just want to be, sitting in the forum having conversations like this, and like, you know thoughts, and they go out into the world, and
Yeah.
so it on the, I'm not going to say it's a bad thing, but like I guess on the less positive side of things, it also means that there's like a real intellectualization of feelings.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no just, oh, I'm sad, let me just feel sad. Like, no, we have to analyze, why are we sad?
Mm-hmm.
It does not help that my moon is in like a partile trine with Mercury, so it's like we are always thinking. But yeah, there's a great deal of thinking with,
Mm.
my Libra moon in particular.
Yeah. And do you think that some of the tension with how your thoughts and other people's resources or what other people will take, how those overlap speaks to the kind of eighth house placement?
Oh,
uh,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, with your moon in the fourth activating, Mercury in particular in the eighth, but your sun there as well.
Yeah, it's just always like kind of a surprise that, and it hasn't happened to me personally, but
Mm-hmm.
seeing people in the community who I really respect having their work ripped off, that for me is like, well, why would you do that? Why, like, what? I don't
Mm-hmm.
understand. And then, just that eighth house anxiety thing churning on it, and just having these ideas around like, well, I have to protect everything I do, or it's gonna get, and it's just, it's it's not a good place to be. So it's one of those things where astrology helps you work with your placements, I think.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm interested your perspective as an academic, because I consider myself like, I don't know, quasi academic. I think citation is something that's really important for me. It's which I kind of learned through academic studies. But I think it's just important to cite sources, and perhaps it's my own Mercury and Capricorn that just loves to kind of like build ideas and build kind of intellectual structures, and doesn't, not that it doesn't mind where it gets the ideas from, but it's like, okay, the thing is more of the building, and so I don't mind the citation of, okay, I've learned this idea from this person and I learned this idea from this person, and I'm kind of bringing these building blocks together to try to synthesize something that I perhaps have thought about or have combined with my own experience. But I'm interested, I know that there's like this kind of tension in the astrological community with citation, and I'm just
Is
interested to hear
there?
your thoughts. I think so. I think people think that it's kind of like we're bowing to the academy or something somehow. That we are like, um, yeah, I don't know exactly how to frame it, but I think people think that it's this kind of unnecessary thing, or that's this thing that is overly formalizing of knowledge or overly kind of controlling of knowledge.
Gotcha. Okay, I haven't been on Twitter in a while, and when I do pop on, I'm like, okay, this is cool, and then I leave before I find a
Uh-huh.
discourse, because I can't
It's
do
a
the
great way
discourse
to do
anymore.
it.
Right. Like I I absolutely do not think that it's like an over formalization. Again, I'm coming at this as a current academic.
Hmm.
But it's like we have the ability and the resources to be able to say, oh, I know where this thought came from. It was
Hmm.
not mine. Um, and it's not that it's an attempt to like gatekeep or to prevent people from having knowledge or to make more work in the synthesizing of ideas, but it is, I mean, just for me, the correct thing to do to say, hey, I got this idea from this person or this person's work influenced mine. I mean, I loved how you opened the podcast and just saying, like, what were your influences? Because none of us are learning in a vacuum. It's
Hmm.
learning is an inherently, it's inherently an exchange between ourselves and other people, ourselves and the world, whatever. I don't think it does any disservice to say I got this from this person or this place or something. I'm also flipping it around and I'm going, why would you not give credit where it was due? Because then you're going to be asked to explain yourself and look like an idiot when you can't. So if you just
Mm.
simply say, I got this from somewhere else and I think it's cool and add on it,
Hmm.
you don't look like an idiot.
I think people are afraid to look like students because I think a lot of people, for better or worse, and like I don't have a great understanding of this, and in some ways, like I'm kind of doing this as well. I'm like a new student. I've like started a practice. I think people think that if they are trying to monetize their practice, it behooves them to not look like a student and to look more
Mm.
like an expert. Um, I obviously think that we're all students, all like not obviously, but my philosophy is that we're all students always, and you hear this from people who have been astrologers for a very long time, like Rob Hand, Demetra George. I feel like just made this similar comment on an astrology podcast episode. But I think people are just afraid of not looking like an expert, even when they're not an expert.
I can get that. I mean, I can understand that that would be a perspective, but it just kind of brings me back to you're trying to look like an expert when you're not. So the minute you're asked to explain something, you've exposed yourself as not an expert. So
Yeah.
why bother? I mean, this might just be like I have so many Saturnian and Martial just placements, but it's like, why would you
Hmm.
bother with that kind of subterfuge rather than just be honest about it? And like you said, we're all students. I mean, I think the best astrologers are the ones who are still continually learning.
Yeah.
They're still looking to their peers, they're still looking to new books, new resources. Anybody that I follow in the community and that I really respect is saying, like what you've said, I'm still learning. I'm still going to find new things.
Hmm.
I do think we all have this like pressure from capitalism maybe to monetize things or to appear a certain way or to project expertise, but I do find that to be to the detriment of everyone, like not only
Yeah.
the astrological community but the clients,
Hmm.
who may be booking to get a certain experience and they don't have it. We need all levels of astrologers. We need the beginning astrologers, we need the experts, we need everyone in between, and we need all of the different things that people are learning
Hmm.
separately, individually. So yeah, it just it breaks my heart that people would feel like they have to like pretend they don't have to anymore to learn because
Hmm.
I don't know. Big ninth house Jupiter, like that's just what we do. We learn.
Right. Yeah. And I was just on the Art of the Zodiac's like IG live, and they were like, "Oh, I really kind of admire your Mercury placement because you're able to kind of spout off all these references." And maybe it's also part of my own kind of privilege that I'm just able to kind of recall that information and think in that way, where I'm just like, I know I got this idea from this place. Um, and even if I can't remember, I'm like, I know I didn't just think of it. I know I got it from somewhere. Um, So I don't know. I'm just trying to give that as a little disclaimer too, where it's like it's relatively easy for me to have things in these kind of be able to locate them in my mind of like where I found them in the world. And I
Yeah.
know not everybody can necessarily do that. I don't know.
I mean, personally, it's not like a natural talent of mine to make connections, say like, oh, I know where I got this from. Um, so I write it down. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's just the right thing to do. If you didn't have that idea, I mean, I could have presented fatalism and determinism as my own thing earlier, but that's just not right.
Mm-hmm.
And I would want people to go read the actual work where I got that from. So I think the other part of it is it's not just around right and wrong or, can you remember or not? It's around uplifting other people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think, you mentioned people want to appear like an expert. Um, but that is a very like competitive way to approach being in a group of people. It doesn't have to be a community necessarily, but if you're looking at like, well, I have to be the expert,
Mm-hmm.
then you're not giving everyone around you the chance to be uplifted by the sharing of knowledge. So
Right.
calling out who you learned from, calling out workshops that you benefited from, astrologers whose work you admire, it gives everyone a chance to see someone new. And then, you show yourself as somebody who's willing, I guess, to play nice with others, and be
Mm-hmm.
uplifted in turns was, and it's not something that I think should be looked at as a tit for tat, well, I said your name, so now you have to say, like, no, it's not about
Yeah.
that. It is about, I think, being a good community member.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to remember, and Oscar Diaz mentioned this, like, he's like, there are so many clients I could never see all the people that want to see me. I really respect his practice. We have
Mhm.
similar kind of outlook or techniques that we're using. And I really appreciated him saying that because I do think that that's true. And I think it's a good perspective to take. I also think that um, I try and think about the looking. I think it's important for new practitioners or whatever. And I speak as not like an expert on this because I'm a student astrologer. I'm a new practitioner of like people are coming for you not necessarily just because of your knowledge, but the totality of yourself and what you bring to your practice, of which your knowledge of technique and of astrology and what have you is a part of that. But there's so much more that people bring to their practice that attracts clients. And so I think it's important. People are kind of selling themselves short, I think, if they objectify themselves, for lack of a better term, just to the way that they think or just to their knowledge, rather than seeing themselves as a whole person that's attractive to a client.
Absolutely. No, that's a very good point. I had that happen for me recently where I was kind of posting on, close friends on Instagram, and I'm like, oh, I'm thinking about opening for a certain reading again, but um, I had realized that one of the reasons I didn't was for the very reason why we're talking about, which is I'm like, oh, but I'm not as, poetic as some of my, the people I
Mm,
admire are, or I'm not as expert with techniques. And several people called me in and said, look, that's not what it's about.
mm,
They want to connect with you.
mm-hmm.
Um, and like I said, I'm not going to name names on this one because, this was like a private conversation, but,
Yeah.
they did tap me and say like, hang on a minute, it's not about you being expert or poetic or um your knowledge being specialized in a certain way. It's about the sum of the experience. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a thing that I tell writers all the time because like I'm also a writer,
Right.
and they're like, well, I can't tell this story because somebody else has already told it, and or I'd be stealing their idea. I'm like, no, because nobody's going to tell a story exactly the same way you do. And if
Mm-hmm.
we as astrologers look at ourselves as storytellers, nobody's going to tell the story of the stars the same way that you are, based
Mm,
on your life experiences, based on how your Saturn return went, or how this transit
mm,
went, or this zodiacal releasing period. So we all of us have that unique opportunity to bring something other than that commercialized expertise to the table.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful way of framing it. I really appreciate you saying that. And I also just want to say you also speak to the importance of having a community of peers or friends or practitioners, however you want to phrase it, around you to kind of like help keep us honest, and help keep us um, motivated. And so, if anyone's listening and feels isolated, I know that the social media fabric is kind of fragmented right now, but I mean, I just encourage people to find fellow travelers on this journey of astrological learning, because I think it's really important. And sometimes we can prevent ourselves, like you mentioned, from being, I don't frame this in a way to judge you, but like not being generous because we don't feel like we have something to give, and other people can show us like the truth that maybe we can't see.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to put it. And especially in the context of what I was saying earlier about like, oh, I've got to protect it. And it's like, well,
Mm,
do you? Or if you're sitting there protecting yourself and your things all the time, then you're never going to get out and grow. So it's like, I mean, like you said, having that, good group of people around you. And they may not all be astrologers,
yeah.
friends or family, people who you can talk to. Um, but just approaching things from somewhere other than a scarcity mindset.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right. In terms of the moon, are there aspects that the moon makes in your chart that you think would be important to discuss?
Yeah, I think we've talked pretty extensively about the Moon Mars opposition, so I'll kind of
Mm-hmm.
move past that.
Okay.
Although that's been, I think the one thing I'll say is that it's been a process of helping myself to see Mars as a bodyguard and not as a jailer,
Mm,
because Mars is in that, superior position, top of the chart, so well resourced. Um, I used to look at my chart and be like, oh, Mars is beating up the moon again. And it's like,
mm,
what an ugly way to think of it.
mm-hmm.
So if you are somebody who has an aspect like that where it looks like a malefic is, having a hard aspect to something else, and you're tempted to think that it means something terrible, try to think how to rephrase that and how to reframe, the view of that, because
Mm-hmm.
what it took was it was actually sitting with Sphere and Sundry's Luna and Cancer materia and going, well,
Mm,
hang on a minute. The moon is the queen of the
mm-hmm.
night. She is
Mm-hmm.
she's the leader of, the night team. Why am I sitting here acting like, she has no say in anything that Mars does?
Mm,
So that, I think, especially like I have the Dodecatomary of Mars and the Law of Courage also in Cancer. So it's like, well, hang on a minute. No, you are in a way answering to her.
mm-hmm.
So just kind of like finding ways to reframe that has been, again, another challenge, but a necessary one.
Yeah. And forgive me or correct me if I'm reading this the wrong way, because I'm
Mhm.
kind of just like looking at your chart. And I haven't looked at it too much, but Mars has, even though the Mars is at the top of your chart because of its relationship to the moon, it's actually rising behind the moon.
Mhm.
So it's following her. And so if we think about spear bearing, the concept of Dorophoria in Hellenistic astrology, which Demetra George talks about in her volume 1. The Mercurianians have done like a whole series of episodes from Notorious about spear bearing on their podcast this season.
Mhm.
I believe Mars is spear bearing for the moon, but it's again the similarities between our charts. I have a similar thing where Mars follows the moon in the first whole sign house, but he's within 3 degrees of
Mhm.
her, so he's maltreating her. So there's this tension between being her bodyguard, but like getting a little bit too close,
Mhm.
and the interesting ways that that can show up for me. And again, like you mentioned, kind of how we think about that. Do we think about it as like a maltreatment? Do we think about it as a protection? Do we think about it as this interesting combination of both? And then how to again work with that kind of energy.
Yeah. No, and then I think the maltreatment comes in terms of how things play out. So like um I live 500 miles from the parents that I love very dearly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that like there's no like abuse in that relationship, but it is not great, to
Mm-hmm.
be caught up and separated for whatever reason. Um, or in terms of, I've got notes here about Mars as the traveler. So we've got delineations in Hellenistic and then in some medieval Islamic texts where Mars or the moon and signs of Mars is indication of somebody who travels far from home or who will travel often. And if we think about it in the context of, that time period, it was a much more dangerous thing to do. You'd be
Mm-hmm.
away from your resources, you'd be away from your friends and family. Um, you might encounter dangerous animals or shipwrecks or like bad things would happen. So that's where I see more of the maltreatment coming in. Or at least, again, like where I used to say Mars is beating up on my moon, it's like, well, hang on a minute, like it doesn't have to. It could just be like these other ways that it's being expressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and you just reminded me, if I may, really quickly, about like the context of the essential dignity kind of schema and this idea of like being far from home,
Mm-hmm.
in what we call like detriment or antithesis or what have you. Um, and it reminds me of Plato's Apology, which is the dialogue or the story of Socrates' death. And Socrates specifically chose to, he was condemned by the Athenian Senate or what have you for corrupting the minds of the youth through the practice of his philosophy. And his followers in that story are basically like, Socrates, like, let's get out of here. Like, you can basically escape in the night. Um, and that would mean that he would be in exile in a foreign land, which would make him vulnerable to a variety of ills and difficulties. And so he chose to take hemlock, which was his punishment, which is death by the consumption of poison, so that he did not have to live the life of an exile. And I just think it's an interesting kind of description of what being far from home or being not allowed to be in the city state or the place where you're from, what it meant in that context. Obviously, it's a very different world that we live in today, but it's interesting to just consider that context, I think.
Yeah, I think we still do see it today because like the whole wanderlust or like
Mm-hmm.
digital nomad, it's the new cool thing to do. But then you keep reading all these stories about people who get there and they're like, oh my God, nothing works the way I thought it would, or I can't get access
Mm-hmm.
to this, or things are too slow, or too, so there again, we have the maltreatment there, like
Right.
where one of these indicators of travelers is like, I don't know, say like the moon in a sign of Mars 3 days after birth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, that's not a great thing necessarily,
Yeah.
but it is, it's a thing where I think we've gotten divorced from the original, I guess, reasons for why certain things are at least in Hellenistic astrology brought forward today. And I'm not sure if that made any sense at all, but
Yeah, it absolutely did. Yeah. That's a great point. Did you want to talk about any other aspects? The Neptune square, I think you have made a note of.
we can do the Neptune square. That's been in it. So this is one where like as a Hellenistic astrologer, primarily, I don't usually pay very much attention to the outer planets. I
Mm-hmm.
look at them, I have my own ideas and conceptualizations of them. Um, Neptune I cannot ignore because it is
Mm-hmm.
in a very tight T square with the Mars and the Moon opposition. So it's making the point of that T square.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's in my seventh. So there's that whole thing of like you have this really big like Mars Moon. Okay, I'm gonna go to synastry for a minute, but like Mars Moon can be really spicy,
Mm-hmm.
And then you bring Neptune into the mix, and it's just like, is it though? Or did you just imagine this?
Yeah.
So it's like having to be really careful about what I'm seeing or what I think I'm experiencing, making sure that it's real and not putting it on any kind of pedestal. Uh,
Mm.
so like with the moon, that will play into my home. So like I lived abroad for a number of years. It's like 8 years total. And I really idealized a lot of my experience there. I was briefly married while I was over there. So here we have like Neptune in the seventh and, square with Moon in the fourth. So like it just blew up into this whole like bubble of a situation that eventually popped very badly.
Hmm.
Um,
Bubbles popping feels very Neptune coded in general.
it does. And I also see it as like an intensification of fantasy, though. I like wrote a whole blog
Hmm.
post about how like, yeah, bubbles pop, but sometimes they just persist.
Mm.
Um, and I'm not sure how you
That's
feel about
almost like worse.
yeah, yeah. And like I'm not sure how you feel about language on the podcast, but there's like a Mars Neptune. I
Oh,
call it
you
the
can
mon
curse. It's
I
okay.
can do it. Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. I call it the monster fucker configuration.
Okay.
Sam Reynolds had a much more um or like appropriate way to express it, but um so yeah, credit to Sam for bringing that to my attention. Like the Mars Neptune hard aspect is or can be, somebody who likes werewolf stories or, and what have I written like my entire life is basically like monster fucker romance.
Mm.
Some kind of element of a werewolf, a vampire, aliens. So we see again like Mars Moon being very spicy, but then like Neptune coming in like werewolves.
Hmm. Hmm.
um, so that's
In the
just
seventh, like associated with romance.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it's always like a partnership more than like just a pure like I don't know romantic fling.
Dalliance. Yeah.
Right, right.
Hmm.
So just put a little spicy fun in the moon chat.
Hmm. Awesome. Yeah. And it's interesting to think about. I don't have like formed thoughts about this, but someone was just talking about triplicity lords on Twitter. And so I was just thinking about like the first triplicity lord of the seventh and the second triplicity lord of the fifth and how those are kind of like those kind of interplay. The first triplicity lord of the seventh is like the partner.
Mm-hmm,
The second of the fifth is pleasure. And
mm-hmm,
so there's this kind of, and typically, or not typically, always, because the elements go kind of hand in hand
mm-hmm.
with the seventh and the fifth. In your chart, you have a water sign in the fifth, and you have an earth sign in the seventh. So those are going to be the same triplicity rulers. Um, and so there's an interesting thing with like, yeah, the first for an earth sign in a day chart is Venus, and then the second for a water sign is Mars ruling kind of like pleasure. So there's a kind of interesting interplay with that as well that kind of comes in, I think, too.
Yeah. And then Mars and Venus are trine in my chart, which I think Austin Coppock said Mars Venus aspects are scandalously charming.
Mm.
So that comes through in the writing, like Mars ruling my fifth.
Hmm.
So there's I don't know, there's just a lot of fun stuff going on there.
Yeah, and there's something interesting about like the sixth house and this idea of like subservience being associated with the sixth, because it's like, how can you have an equal relationship with a werewolf? Or
Right.
like there's like a very real power dynamic that's there.
And power dynamics are 100% a theme in like everything I write. So it's
Mm.
yeah, it all comes in very literally. And I think that's probably just another echo of the Moon Mars opposition.
Yeah. And you make this note about synastry with people talking a lot about Mars Venus, but you think that Moon Mars is an interesting kind of synastry element. And so I'm just curious if you have anything
Yeah.
else you want to say about that.
Yeah, so like when you learn synastry, typically, they say look for Mars Venus aspects
Mm-hmm.
um, in the two charts. In my personal experience, those are good, but if you want like a really spicy bang, you go with Moon Mars.
Mm.
So like the most like explosive, like emotionally, romantically, sexually, on all levels, relationship that I was in. Um, his moon was on my Mars, and so then my moon would have been opposing it and sextile by sign to his Mars. So there was, and then so there was just a lot of like Moon Mars interplay between the two charts in fire signs.
Yeah, it sounds fiery.
Look for Moon Mars.
Interesting. Yeah, have you tracked the moon in relation to your like life, whether it be your emotional life or what have you? And if so, what have you found?
Always exhausted. Moon in Gemini. Gemini
Feel
being my
that.
12th. I like
Especially Saturn and Pisces. It's been extra special for me.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, I have like a moon. I have Moon Mars in the first in Sag, and so I think when the moon is opposing that, it's like it's one thing. It wasn't so bad when Saturn was in Aquarius. It's just felt very kind of like frenetic for me with Saturn and Aquarius because of the kind of square that gets activated with everything. So yeah, it's interesting to think about how the moon can manifest differently via transit in comparison to other planets by transit.
Yeah, no, definitely feeling that because Saturn in Pisces is my opening Saturn square. So Saturn in Sagittarius, natally, transiting Saturn in Pisces, and then now the moon is coming in to oppose and square everything, or like make a T-square in a way. And it's just like, I cannot, I'm like emotionally drained, I'm weighed down, I'm like, I do not feel great. And then, just like I mentioned, the cadent houses generally have more vivid dreams or just like more detailed dreams. Moon in Aries has been just like it just exacerbates the existing Moon Mars situation. So it's like emotional explosions. So that's where I come back to, the moon or whoever doesn't make you do anything, but you do have opportunities to be more aware of how you might react to things.
Right.
But then like on a fun note, I'm trying to see when I'm most likely to win the lottery.
Nice.
So like
I love this.
So I found, and I can't even remember which book I found it in, but maybe it was Firmicus. There's a passage or something that talks about the moon transiting through a sign in aversion to both malefics brings gifts. And that sign for me happens to be Scorpio in the fifth. So, can't see it. I guess it would be Taurus as well. But I focus on Scorpio because it has the trine from Jupiter. So I'm like, okay, what if gifts could be from gambling? Which I am not encouraging gambling. Like, please, people, do not go out and just like go crazy with lottery tickets. But it has been kind of fun to just like get a scratch card and see what the moon is doing and just like see when I can win. And I found that like I tend to have more luck when the moon is in my second, so squaring that second, the fifth house, and then trining Mars. And I've shifted more to scratch cards because fifth house is ruled by Mars. Mars seems agitated. So I'm like, all right, scratch cards. Yeah. So that is my like little quirk that has become like an obsession these days. Not an addiction, but it is just like, ooh, I haven't tried in a while. Let's like test this out again.
I love that. Keep us updated if you win the lottery, or maybe don't tell anybody. If Whitney disappears from social media one day, we're up.
If I disappear, I've bought an island.
Figured it out.
Right. Goodbye.
Amazing. What suggestions would you have for someone new to astrology or planetary relationship in forming or initiating a relationship with the moon?
Really, like I said when we started, was just going out and looking at it. I'm continually surprised by how often I say something about the moon's phase or something happening with the moon, something going on in the sky, and people are like, wait, really? I'm like, do you not look? It's right there. It's right there.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of times we get caught up on having the right program or having the right learning or having the right books. And it's like, just go outside and look at the sky and see what it
Yeah.
does. Um, Look at when, the moon is closer, when it's farther away, and looks bigger or smaller. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Look at what's happening with the phase. Look at when it's rising or setting, um, and see how that's reflected in the chart of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So, what can you see overhead? Okay, where do you think the midheaven is? And just get a
Mm.
really practical, physical understanding of how a chart works. And that, I think, is a great way to um, engage not only with astrology, but just like with the sky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good idea. I love that. Yeah, it's like when the sun is setting and the moon is waning, you should be able to see the moon in the sky.
Right.
Yeah, or if the
No, if the sun is setting, the moon should be waxing if you want to see it.
okay, yeah, there you go. And vice versa for the moon rising, I suppose. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, for the sun rising. So if the sun is rising and the moon is waning, you should be able to see the moon at sunrise.
I think so. And here I am like,
Yeah,
you guys, you should just look at the sky. You should learn it. And
right.
it's like,
But it's like
oh,
doing diurnal and zodiacal motion in your head is
right, you're going in two
hard.
different directions. So
Yeah.
yeah, I do not have a chart pulled up right now to like
Hmm.
visualize it. So
Yeah.
giving myself that out.
No, it's a great point though. Yeah, and something obviously still need to brush up on. And um wonderful. Is there anything that you want to add, or do you have any imparting thoughts about the moon?
I think we pretty much covered everything, and
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, this has been, we kind of went off course a little bit. I think I pulled like Mars into it a lot, so I'm sorry about
Hmm.
that. But
No, so
um,
it's all good.
cool, cool.
Yeah, did you want to comment about the eclipses, or we kind of talked about it at the beginning?
Um, I think we kind of talked about it at the beginning.
Cool.
I will just say, like, I need, like, I just generally need folks to recognize, like, whatever happened 9 years ago at the Aries Libra eclipses is probably not going to happen the same way again. So,
Hmm.
um, like for myself, I had one of the lunar eclipses was exactly on my MC, and I stood under the baleful rays and observed it. And then I was
Mm.
like, I lost my job, or I didn't lose my job. I left my job and had an unexpectedly difficult time finding work for like the
Mm.
next 7 months. Um, but I'm not sitting here thinking like, oh, I'm going to be out of work again, or I'm going to lose my home.
Yeah.
No, it's not all going to happen the same. But it is, I think, still worthwhile to look at these upcoming eclipses and just say like, okay, where are they in my chart, and like what themes might come up again.
Yeah. Yeah, what was happening 9 years ago, what was happening like 18 years ago, because the lunar return was the south node and the north node were in the same place around that time. And then also for your own personal astrology, like what perfection year were you in? Because, if you're in a Libra perfection, that's going to be perhaps more telling. Or if you're in a moon ruled perfection year, that might be more telling as well.
Which I
Um,
am this year. Fun times.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. I'm in a Libra perfection from fortune. So my lot of fortune is perfecting to Libra. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So far, it's been invited to speak at things and be visible, which has been fun.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I think that's the other thing is like a lot of I like will semi-jokingly hype up the baleful rays, like, don't go out, it's bad, it's terrible, the moon is corrupted. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like it doesn't have to be bad things. Like there was the okay, so there was the great conjunction, Jupiter and Saturn conjoining 0 degrees Aquarius on the degree of my sun a month before my birthday. At my solar return, there was a lunar eclipse at 0 degrees Leo. So it
Mm-hmm.
activated that great conjunction. And the next 4 years, anytime it was usually Jupiter, but or not Jupiter, the sun. Anytime a planet kind of conjoined 0 degrees Aquarius, good things happened. You
Mm-hmm.
know, like I won awards, I was invited to speak at things. I got selected for promotions, like for my books and things. So it's like, to your point, it's not always, the bad things of the baleful rays. It is just a very activated point.
Yeah. Totally. Keeping my fingers crossed for you for Pluto back in Aquarius.
So am I. That was the thing that I looked at and was like, I get 7 passes of Pluto over my sun in the eighth.
Mm,
I'm like, no, you're not going to die like you did the length of life. That's being very
mm,
extreme. That's being very eighth house extreme humor.
yeah.
Ignore it. But um, the first pass was pretty heavy. I'm not going to lie.
Mm, yeah. And sometimes it's just good to know that
Yeah. Yeah.
you
And
can get ready for it, adjust.
you can get ready for it. But I think what a lot of people tend to do is obsess
Hmm.
or worry or like think the worst of it.
Right.
And that is a tendency that I have anyway as an eighth house Aquarius sun. Like I'm just
Mm,
automatically assuming everything's bad. But it's an exercise I found helpful is what if something good happens? What if this does work
mm,
out? So instead of saying,
yeah.
oh my God, something terrible, it's like, well, what if it's good?
Hmm.
So I would just encourage anybody who does have those same tendencies, to look at charts and be anxious to start asking yourself, like, as we said with Moon and Mars, like, how do you reframe that? How do you change that idea of the relationship between the planets that are involved in this transit? I'm thinking, like, also take a step away from the charts. If you have anxiety,
Right.
don't do it anymore for just a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe try to shift if you have this kind of practice more towards a spiritual practice where you're practicing meditation or doing, you know, devotion or what have you might be more helpful in those times than like, yeah, getting more chart brained or what have you.
Right. Doom astrologizing.
Yeah. All right, Whitney, where can we find you? And is there anything you're working on you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, so you can find me at cobraandcrescent.com. I'm also on Instagram as Cobra and Crescent. I technically have a Twitter, but it's locked because I don't know what's happening there these days and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not here for it.
Mm-hmm.
But I have started shifting over to a members only space that I'm currently working on building. It's going to be called the Ibis Nest, and I'm going to be posting my work there going forward. Partly because this whole chat GPT like nonsense of scraping the web.
Mm-hmm.
Squarespace does not allow you to put the little piece of code that tells them not to do that. And
Mm.
unfortunately, paywalling is kind of like the only way to keep your work secure
Mm.
in that case. So, well, I say unfortunately, I'm also, obviously looking to take myself to the next level and, support myself with my ideas.
Right.
Moon,
Absolutely.
Moon, Mercury ideas, all of that. Um, so yeah, I'm working on that. Working on some research into fate. I'm working on research into the Egyptian decans,
Mm-hmm.
into fixed stars. So all of that is going to be on that members only space going forward.
Amazing. And do you have to write a thesis for your grad program? Do you know
I
what you're going to be
do.
writing about yet?
I would like to write on, again, ideas. Uh,
Uh-huh.
I'd like to write on the Egyptian decans.
Mm-hmm.
I've just really fallen into this whole, I guess, question of like the origins of astrology
Mm-hmm.
in the Ptolemaic era of Egypt and to the Hellenistic period, um, and just trying to I don't know, I've become obsessed with the decans. Like the thing that we use them for now in an astrological chart is not what they were originally for. So I
Mm-hmm.
want to like understand better how that shift occurred.
By that, do you mean they were used more for like mundane world astrology or?
They weren't used for astrology at all. They were used for timekeeping.
Mm.
So, and then they weren't like
And
these.
astrology was separate from timekeeping in Egypt.
No, not particularly. I should say that it developed later.
Ah, okay.
So the decans as timekeepers, um, from reading, Egyptian astronomical texts, Nogabar and Parker, those were coming in as timekeepers in like the Ramesside period or earlier. So we're talking 1200 years BC, if I recall
Mm-hmm.
correctly.
Mm-hmm.
When Hellenistic astrology wasn't developed until closer to like 100 BC.
Right.
So we're like, we've got centuries between,
Almost a millennia.
more, I
Yeah.
think. So not only were they like these instruments of timekeeping during the night so that you could figure out when to do your rituals, in the temples, but then they were also, like I said, these like entities that you could call on for protection and for defense. So it's like, how did we go from that to just like nailing them onto this 10-degree section of sky?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Really excited to see your work on that.
thank
That's
you.
really intriguing. Yeah. All right, Whitney, this has been incredible, so educational. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experience. I really appreciate it. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. This was actually my debut on an astrology podcast, so I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity for it. And I just hope all the listeners, find something useful in it.
Well, it was definitely my pleasure. All right, take care. To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.